much for beginning by joining us in acknowledging that we stand upon the ancestral and contemporary homelands of the Anishinaabe. In doing so, we seek to heal traumas inflicted by an ongoing history of colonization and to correct intergenerational injustice. By acknowledging this, we respect these vibrant, living, and present cultures. This is how we choose to move forward with humility, honor, gratitude, and a shared love for this beautiful place and the stories within it. Tonight's event is supported by annual donors to the museum, and so we are so grateful for those who support us each year. And I just want you to know that we have this really special program where if you give $100 to the museum here in Marquette, it supports education and programs that we do here, but you also get a reciprocal membership that's good at more than 1,200 places across North America. So Canada, the US, Mexico, and it works. And so you get free admission at all these other places while supporting your local arts and culture community. So something to consider. There's information at the desk and then also on every one of my emails. There's a link you can click and you can donate right there. So thank you so much for all of you who support us here in this work. It is my great pleasure tonight to introduce Carrie /VanderVeen and Catherine Benda, two Upper Peninsula artists who it was just such a joy to work with on this show. They're dedicated to their practice, and I think that you can see that in the color, light, and promise of hope in their work in the gallery, which we'll all be enjoying in just a little bit. Each of these artists will speak for 20 minutes. Then we'll allow like 2 questions, and then you're welcome to ask questions in the other room after, okay? So that's just the rules of the event. Carrie will speak first, and then Cathy will speak second. Carrie works in gouache paint. If you don't know what gouache paint is, you'll soon learn. And she received her Bachelor's of Science in Architecture at the University of Michigan and her MFA from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She is the curator-director of the Finlandia Art Gallery in Hancock, Michigan, and has been for
21 years.
Okay. And then Catherine Benda is a multimedia artist who's working in paint, thread, and paper. She received her BFA from Central Michigan University in painting and drawing. She lives and works in Marquette, but she spent 40 years living along the shore of Lake Superior up in Keweenaw County. And so we'll hear from Cathy, second. Without further ado, I will pass it over to Carrie.
Well, thank you very much for coming tonight, and all my friends and family who are always so supportive of me. It means a lot, so thank you for being here. Emily, this has been such a joy for me. You gave me a purpose this year, which is really an awesome superpower to be able to give someone a purpose, so thank you. And to David and Emily and the whole crew at DeVos, I'm super impressed with this place. It's such a gem for the community, so thank you for having me here. My name is Carrie, and I've been living for the last 25 years in Hancock. And tonight I'm going to share with you information about my influences and also my techniques and the process of returning to art making very late in life after a very long break, and you'll see why I had a long break. But, Emily, okay, here we go. So, as I've aged, I've become a lot more reflective, looking at the path that I've taken to get to today and the life experiences and the choices I've made along the way. And now that my children are grown and living full lives of themselves, the question I began to ask myself is, how do I remain present and relevant to myself in my own life, especially when life is constantly changing? So I sent 2 kids to college, and I decided it was a time to start making my art again. And this has been a really great privilege to have the time to do that. And the new perspective that I have on art making at this time in my life is that I'm a lot freer with my process. I don't question myself all the time about what I'm making or why I'm making it or how I'm making it. And that's like a real gift to be able to think about how you want to be creative and not be self-judgmental. So when somebody asks me what my art's about, I always hesitate to answer. It's a hard question to answer in a few sentences, so I usually say something like, I use plants and birds and butterflies to symbolically examine the human experience, and usually people look at me and kind of nod and say, okay, and move on. So you can see my work is full of images of nature, but I don't really consider myself a nature artist. The worlds I create are imaginary, fantastical, romantic, and metaphorical. So I mostly use natural imagery as a metaphor for life in all its stages. So I was recently reading an article and a book about a book called The Origins of You, How Childhood Shapes Your Life. And it's basically looking to answer the question of how did I become who I am? And their study offered this metaphor that suggests that humans are like storm systems. Each individual storm has its own particular set of traits and dynamics, and meanwhile, but its future depends on numerous things, and it can be changed by all the events around it. So how did my storm systems bring me to create the work that you're going to see in the gallery? I grew up in Lower Michigan, spending my summers on the shore of Lake Michigan, which really developed a deep reverence for nature in me, and especially the big lake, which is one reason my husband and I decided to move to the UP. I was the youngest of 5, and it was a very traditional Midwestern upbringing. I went to the University of Michigan and studied architecture, which was a really wonderful and challenging major. It opened me to my love of creativity, but my buildings were kind of more like sculptures. I thought a lot about how light entered the space. I designed peace centers, a community center for bikes. I designed a mausoleum for one of my favorite artists, but needless to say, when I went into the working world, it was nothing like this. So everything changed for me after graduation in '86. I started a series of trips. I went to India, Nepal, and Thailand by myself for 6 months. And then I also went to Egypt and Spain and Portugal with my husband. But those trips fundamentally changed my life. Like I said, this is where I started. Very kind of young, naive Midwestern person that didn't know much about the broader world. So I returned from traveling. I worked in architecture for about 6 years on and off, and then I went back and got a degree in art, a Master of Fine Art from Wisconsin. I finished. I remember walking out, being done with my MFA, and thinking, "Oh no, how am I going to make money now?" And I got certified to teach in the elementary school, and I taught art in the elementary school for about 3 years while my husband finished his PhD. By the time we moved up to the Upper Peninsula, we had 2 kids, and I spent 4 lovely years at home taking care of them. I then became the director part-time at Finlandia and the curator. And then late in life, I finally can see myself as an artist again, mostly because I have the luxury of time to make art. So if I could use a metaphor to describe the process of bringing creativity back into my life after a very long break, I would say it's like a pomegranate. So I always buy pomegranates at this time of year because I really love them, but I'm also a little intimidated by them. I know something wonderful is inside, but the outside shell is tough, and once inside, the process of getting to the good stuff is a lot of work. You extract the seed, and you get a bite, and it's a shot of sweetness, but at the same time, you taste that hard seed. So little by little, you work your way through that sweet and soft and hard combination, and it's pleasurable and a little unsettling, and there's always a few rotten seeds in there that you have to get through. So persistence is the key. So I'm going to start now showing you some of my very first work after taking a 20-year break of art making. So I didn't make artwork for 20 years. And in 2019, we moved to New Zealand. I took some paints with me. I'd always been curious about gouache. These are tiny little paintings, 8 by 10. They're not something I would typically show to an audience, but what I wanted you to see from this is, first of all, there was a speed bump for me to get over, to start painting again. It's not like riding a bike. It's difficult to start after so many years. So these were my little step into it after 20 or 18 years off. And so I wanted to show these to see sort of that it's persistence really in practice that gets you where you want to go after many years of working. So when I was working on these paintings, I was living in New Zealand, and I was trying to think about connections across cultures. And we were in Christchurch at the time that the terrorist attack happened on 2 mosques. So I was a visitor there, as the country grieved and tried to deal with the loss and heal. So in these paintings, I was thinking about how we choose to reflect our similarities and our differences. And in my work, throughout my work, you'll see the butterfly image represents both fragility and resilience in the face of adversity. And the tick marks that I started to incorporate in these paintings were a device to express connection, and then they started to play a larger role in my later work. So I'm going to share with you I'm going to peel back the skin of the onion and show you how I started. This was one of the, maybe the 4th or 5th painting I'd made after that long break, but I'm always fascinated with how things are made. So this is gouache paint. And I start with the drawings and start layering up. What I didn't realize when I packed gouache paint to start working after so many years is that it's a really difficult media. It's a opaque watercolor paint, and it stays soluble to water. It's never really permanent. It just like you add water and it's soluble. And so you start layering paint on top, and it picks up the color from below, and you get a new color. So it's quite fussy and difficult, but I really fell in love with the rich color on the surface. This is the finished piece of that process that you saw, and it's in the show. And it's called Reflecting Growth, and I did 2 more in this series, and these are both in the show too. So this is like my very first working into painting again after a lot of years. So these are the last 3 paintings I made in New Zealand. With each of those paintings, I became a little more comfortable with the gouache. The one problem I had painting with gouache, if anybody's worked with this, I could not figure out how to fix mistakes. It's very difficult because, like I told you before, it just keeps mixing. So you can't really cover them up very easily. I know some people have techniques for figuring it out, but it took me a long time and a lot of really careful painting to figure out how to deal with the gouache, but I loved the quality of it. So we returned back to Michigan. Everybody knows what happened in Michigan and in the world in 2020. It brought a lot of challenge and stress to so many, and the anxiety that I felt in my personal life came into my studio. And so what I did is I just responded by painting things that represented peace and beauty to me. So geraniums, peaches, how lovely does that get, right? So my tick marks, you can notice, became time markers. So I added that 5th slash, and I started a series called Waiting For. So these were the pieces that I created during COVID. So the fragile and resilient butterfly returned, as well as those time marking lines, and the marks became an overlay that both concealed and revealed the image. And I used art at that time to really calm myself, which was really great. I decided to challenge myself and get some bigger paper, 22 by 30, and I started, this is a painting called Waiting for Abundance, part of that series. And I brought this in so you could sort of see the process. So I start with drawing, I move into the gouache layering, and one layer doesn't really cover the paper, so you have to layer upon layer. And I started to get more comfortable with how those colors blended to get your final work. And this is the final piece called Waiting for Abundance, which is in the show. My family in 2011 lived in Hilo, Hawaii for a sabbatical. And my eldest daughter was in 11th grade, my middle daughter was in 8th grade, and my son was in 2nd grade. We had a great time there. We just loved it. And one of the really memorable things for me was the smell of the place. It's very humid, and the fragrance of the flowers is just amazing. So that self-soothing part of me started this painting, and it was really kind of a love letter to my children too. And so I started with the drawing, started adding. Now, I was getting comfortable with how, the layering was going to affect things, but I got really anxious with that third one because the color's so vibrant, and I thought, oh man, is that gaudy, But once I added the tick marks to it, it calmed the colors down. And you can see I started integrating other color tick marks into it, sort of blending it, creating this almost tapestry-like appearance. And I think I'll continue with this a bit. I haven't done too many more, but I started, around this time, I started this series of paintings, which it's similar, but I started incorporating birds. I had felt at this time, it's kind of towards the end of COVID, and I started to feel, and my children were moving out, it was kind of like a big period of transition for me. And I started feeling like I maybe had lost the ability to feel that sense of wonder that you have in the world. Like I remember when I was a college student, I poured cream into my coffee and I'd just sit there and look at it. I had a really easy accessibility to wonder. And I felt like with the pandemic was creating so much suffering, the political climate has been very disheartening, and the environmental crisis has been really demoralizing for me. I just started feeling like I had lost a sense of peace. So I started this series to try to reinvent that sense of wonder in myself. So these are two of the first ones that I did at that time. I dedicated more time to my painting in my studio, and I just willed beauty into my art and into my daily experience. And I acknowledged the struggle, but each mark I made was like a meditation. And I imagined this abundance and it kind of just surrounding myself with color and light and beauty. It made me feel some of that joy that I felt like I was missing. So in doing this, I started looking at nature really closely, marveling at its structure and its color and its beauty and its incredible resilience. And everywhere I visited, I started taking reference photos of plants and flowers that I could maybe put into my paintings later. And just that process made me feel this sense of place and presence. So I tried to manifest this sense of wonder in my art, and through time, I actually started feeling it because I was doing things again that connected me to things that were important to me. So the very first slide you saw, there was a piece called Love is the Great Intangible. This is the process of that piece, and you can see here, like I went on a trip to the Everglades with my daughter. We went on a bike trip, and I just was fascinated by the thistles, and we spent a long time photographing them together. So I put those things into my art that remind me of a place I've been, and it's magical. So you can see that building up of the gouache paint and the layers. It's really hard to get, to the final piece where there's this deep, rich color, but it takes a lot of layering. And in this next piece, this piece is called She Reflected on Her Life. And it shows, I usually put a base color down like a blue and do the drawings and then start layering and start moving towards the final piece. So you can see how much layering it takes. That's why it takes so long to create these paintings, but it's a real pleasure to make them. So But if you look closely at the work, if you have a chance in the gallery, you can see how some of the imagery actually weaves in and out of these tick marks. It doesn't completely cover it, so it's that idea of revealing and concealing. So I'm just about done here. We talked about how much we love Hawaii, and we went back there this May for vacation, and I started, these 2 trips come out of that. There's actually like the picture, the bird in the upper corner is from a reference photo that my son took, so it's like a way of bringing family, but love and a lot of things into these paintings. So this is the first time I started adding extinct species that had gone extinct into my work, and I think that's something I may do more in the future. And this is the last painting. This is the largest one I made. This is actually 30 by 40, so it combines the nostalgia of my youth with the nostalgia of my children's youth growing up here. And it's also a recognition that some of the most emblematic species, like the monarch, which was just everywhere in my youth, can face decline from habitat loss and other environmental factors. So the last 2 slides, I thought I'd show you some of my artist references. I thought that might be interesting. These are who I call my grandfather influencers, because I was just telling someone when I was in college, we just studied male artists. Now these are really old artists, but it was all about, art history was greatly male at the time, but this one is sort of my muse. I bought a picture of her in Washington, D.C. in 1991, this picture, and I hung it in my studio, and I admire her composure and her strength, and I keep her with me and close as a reminder to stay strong. The other 2 artists, Milton Avery and Mark Rothko, are 2 people that I just am in awe of their glowing color and emotional use of color. And I also really resonate with the flat sense of space. If you've seen my paintings, they're not really dimensional, they're quite flat. And I've always just enjoyed that. And since I'm using Instagram more, I've been able to find a bunch of contemporary artists that I really like, and these are 3 examples of them. And it's a wonderful thing to have such easy access to seeing what's happening in the contemporary art world. So, 1955, and I'm done. I just want to say thank you to Cathy. It's been really great exhibiting with Cathy. I didn't know her before this, and it's very fun, been really fun. So, thank you.
What's the button?
The button is the
I'm not timing. Okay.
So you are timing it because it's right here.
Oh. Good. All
Okay,
right.
so
Is the button?
Cathy,
Wait. Is the button right here? This one. Okay.
take it away.
Take it away. Well, I also want to thank Emily and Northern Michigan University for this opportunity, and David. I don't think he's here right now. I didn't see him. Is he?
He just stepped out.
For actually coming to my studio to help me figure out how to hang some of the pieces that are in the show today. And I want to thank my friends that are here and my family because I've had this incessant activity this year. It was sort of the challenge of doing something for a year that was pretty time consuming. So it's been a good experience. What I want to do is, it's fun because Carrie and I have never met each other, and yet there's some parallels and there's some differences, and we both are starting kind of at the beginning. And I'd like to say, I want to start here, and I want to start here because there's some students, I think, in the audience, but 50 years ago, I was a student in the audience. working on my BFA. And I thought art was going to be this straight line. I thought I was going to be a student and get my BFA and then show, and it was just going to be this nice trajectory. And it's not like that. And I think Carrie even trajectory is a little bit not like that either. So, and I also had these fantasies of where I would be making art, because you'd see these rooms with these big windows in France, and you think, oh yeah, that's what I'm going to have. Well, shortly after college, this is what I was living in for about 4 months. And the joke in our family was, it was the 70s, and I read one too many Mother Earth News magazines. Because I was a Detroit girl, and I ended up in the UP on the shores of Lake Superior, out by Freedom, Michigan. There's a sign that says the end of the earth. And so, I realized that we've since moved. We were there 40 years. We're in Marquette. But one of the things that I realized was that what I thought was going to happen, a lot of the things I thought was going to happen didn't happen. But a lot of things I never dreamed was going to happen happened. And that's sort of life, and that's sort of the whole thing with being an artist. So I want those who are starting out, recognize there's going to be lots of twists and turns, and those that are artists know exactly what I'm talking about. Thankfully, the tent living only lasts 4 months. I did have a telephone in the tent, and that's a whole nother story with a couple drinks. But yeah, AT&T was really great. But this is where I spent, and my children and my husband and I spent our time, and that's Lake Superior out there. And it was wonderful and exciting and isolating, and every emotion that you can imagine. And it did influence some and most of my early work. So I wanted to show you so I had this fantasy, right, of what spaces should look like. So the reality is, the fantasy's that up window, I got to work in that space for little bits of time. Most of my art was probably done for a long time on the kitchen table in a cabin with a wood cook stove and kids either making music or making art or doing something. And then this is my current studio, but it's never been this tidy. And it actually looks like this, or did look like this right before I packed everything up. So you make your spaces, and it's where work gets done. And it doesn't have to be the fantasy. Just my whole realization was, I can make art wherever I go, whether I have a backpack or whether I have the fantasy space. So that's sort of, about where I made art. But early on, when I was, and this is an unknown artist, I wish I could give him credit. Early on, just after the tent living, I was working on some grants with the Michigan Council for the Arts with little kids. And it was very rewarding, and at the same time it was really frustrating, because I was competing with gym class. I'd pull kids out of gym class and give them art. And sometimes that was a good fit, and sometimes that wasn't for the busy kids. But I also ended up doing a lot with kids, because I worked on developing an indoor play space and creating some play activities for little kids. And I found that this is my biggest inspiration, children's art and the way children play. And what I think is interesting is play and exploration is so important to brain development, but that's what's important to making art, to allow yourself those opportunities without judgment, to just let's go with it. And as I was working with these kids and making this play space, I had access to all these wooden pieces of hardwood, and I decided to make sculptural pieces that would be able to be movable but also could stand alone. And it was another way to kind of push, how can I play with this material, and how can I do something different? And I thought, well, if I make one, that's going to be cool. But what happens after I make 200? So I made 200 of these blocks, And I've since given a lot of them away. But the idea was also that I could change things up as I wanted to see what color and shape and form did with one another. And I think this early work here, which was probably maybe 10, 15 years ago, is can be seen in the work in the gallery here. There's also a lot of low risk, high reward with this type of thing, and I think that's really important to have in your work, or some of the work you're doing. Always have that kind of ability. The other thing I wanted to talk about, as I was doing the 200 blocks and I was trying to get into my studio, I came across this quote from a professor of mine that he said, when you start working in the studio, when you start working, everybody is in your studio, the past, your friends, enemies, the art world, and above all, your own ideas. All are there, but as you continue painting, they start leaving one by one, and you are left completely alone. Then, if you are lucky, even you leave. And I think that became my mantra of saying, okay, I have to just do the work, stay the course. Don't let thinking or your own comparison or judgments or those barriers of thinking, worrying about what other people are thinking, get in the way of making your art. So with that in mind, it's continued to feed into my belief that making art is all about process. This year, with this invitation, it was about sticking with a process, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but what does that look like? And I had two pieces of information. Best advice I got in art school was, the first one was, nothing is precious. And the second one was, every once in a while take a look at your palette, because that's where the best painting is. And again, it's about staying loose, staying open, and being able to take a look at what you're making and not overthinking it. Step away from it for a while. And I thought that was good advice, and every once in a while I think about that. So this was a palette of mine that I decided, I'll take a picture of it. It looks like a pretty decent painting. But more recently, and in a large part related to the space I have available now, I really wanted to look at process. And I usually have two things going on at once. I have, and sometimes three, I have small work that I'm fooling around with that's I'm able to leave out. And I have larger work that I'm working on kind of together. Sometimes one gets most of my attention for a while, and I flip back and forth. Usually the stuff that's left out I work on every day. I just go in and I fool around with it, and I move things around, or I'm gluing. And this happens to be a picture of some block work that I was working on with these same shapes that you'll see out on the paintings, looking at materials and incorporating some new ideas in paper. These are wooden hollow like blocks. They're not a full block like the other ones were. So while I was doing that, I decided last year that I would take something that was in my house and just paint it every day for 6 months, and do this without any really any thinking. Just get up in the morning, paint the vase. And here's a picture from one of my sketchbooks. So I have many sketchbooks that are of this vase and these the Swedish ivy. And all I had to do was show up, take the paper off, and paint. And so again, you get up, you have your cup of coffee, you start not thinking, right? Because the minute you start thinking, it starts changing everything. So this became this incessant activity, but it also deepened my appreciation that this was how I would get into the studio. So if I had these kinds of things going on, it was getting me in there, and then I could continue on with some of my bigger scale paintings. So those vase paintings quickly started to morph into these paper cutouts that I was working on. And they were first intended to be just paper studies, color studies and cutting out paper. And then they started to feel like they could be larger. They started to feel like what would happen if I just expanded these into big canvases. I found myself doing a lot of color theory with them, and again, another way of just getting into the studio and working on something that I could really get absorbed in. This became a daily habit as well as the other thing. So during the time I was cutting out shapes, I was painting the same shapes. I painted them. This is in that gallery as well. I painted them tight. I painted them loose. I painted them in small iterations. I went large, and I changed the color palette. And every time I did that, something new transpired, or it triggered some new idea for me. And I kept on this course. These are all from 2023. I stayed this course, working on these shapes continually this whole past year. Here's another one in that show. So, and they started to change size. You'll see that there's some 16 by 20, there's some matted and framed, there's some really large pieces that have scrolled down. I wanted to see what happened when size changed, and also when they became defined by a mat and a frame, and when they were much looser and more without any boundary on the sides of them. So you'll see that in this piece here. So when I was working on these paintings, I thought, well, let's just take a big roll of gessoed canvas and roll it down and paint directly on that. And these were fun to make. Again, you'll see the repetition of shapes from the paper, from the small paintings, from the tighter matted and framed pieces. This exploration kept triggering a new idea for myself. And so I got really comfortable with this exploration with paint and paper. But then there became this introduction to me with thread. And you'll see the pieces in the gallery. I have a couple pictures, but I want to talk about this whole thread thing. So I don't know if anybody's ever walked the bike path here, but this is on a building, and it was in November of 2020, and I decided I wanted to make myself one evil eye pillow, because everything was really creepy anyway out. And it was pretty low risk because it was just for me, and materials, thread is really inexpensive when compared to paint. And so I made myself one eye pillow, and I think I'll make another one. And we were still pretty cloistered. I don't think anybody had the vaccine yet. I had probably had a lot of cabin fever. And so I'd make another one, and then I just kept making them, and I would throw them on the couch. So you got to visualize, I'm in a chair, my husband's in a chair. Every time there'd be a new eye pillow, and I think it was my son that said, "Mom, this is getting really creepy." I made about 30 of these things, and I gave one to a friend who's not here today, and they said every time this child comes over to the house, the child hides the pillow because it really creeps them out. But I also want to say, when I was making these eye pillows, I wasn't painting very well. I was painting poorly. I was maintaining the sketchbooks, but I was overthinking. Everything was discombobulated. The world was, discombobulated. I was watching the insurrection and making eye pillows, and it was like, okay, there's something about this. And it was, the overthinking was just, mind-boggling to me, because I just couldn't, quiet my brain. But when I stitched, it became meditative. And I think Carrie said something about the mark making. It sort of just calmed me. It was like, oh, it's just a repetitive movement, and it was really, really helpful for me. So then I got hooked. I got hooked. You can get all kinds of wonderful colors at Michael's, and honest to God, they're like 50 cents. They're wonderful. So I started this freeform piece again. Now all these images from my my paperwork and my paint started coming through, and you see my hands coming in on this one. And this piece, it's called Notes to Myself. It's in the gallery. Took me about 200 hours. There was a broken thumb involved, not from sewing, but at the same time. And so there was a lot of sitting down and just methodically working, and this was all freeform. So I would work on something, I'd do a little bit of drawing, but then it would just take off. And as I was making these, I realized that the back was as intriguing as the front. The back was talking to me as well. The knots and the bigger stitches, and sometimes it gets frayed a little bit, and I was really attracted to that. It was at this time also that I started looking at the work of other embroidery artists, like anonymous women who were, you'd go into an antique store and there'd be some embroidered pillowcase. That there's a whole world of needlework and women's work that really became understated. So here we have, these are 2 photographs of this whole year, what I was doing from the thread and the needlework, the painting. You can see the paper cutouts in the studio. And I really thought about this because there's a Steve Jobs quote that I love, and it's this: you can't connect the dots looking forward, you can only connect them looking backwards. So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. You have to trust in something, your gut, destiny, life, karma, whatever. And I thought about that, and I thought, I trust the process, because every piece of this year of my art making that's been rewarding, satisfying, and really felt like it was part of my authentic self was when I was true to the process and didn't worry about product. I just, getting into the studio. And then this is what it looked like in my house with that's my daughter with the eye pillows. But I thought about this because it's been a crazy couple years, and in this, it's so much uncertainty that sometimes people will say, I don't even know why I'm doing this anymore. Like I should be doing something bigger. And I love this quote by Kiki Smith, that just do your work. And if the world needs your work, it will come and get you. And if it doesn't, do your work anyway. You can have fantasies about having control over the world, but I know I can barely control my kitchen sink. That is the grace I am given, because when one can control things, one is limited to one's own vision. And I would say that really has been what's guided me this last year, but when I look back on all the previous years, it's really been the guiding factor in my art making. So, 2002. Questions.
And then you're welcome to ask them all the questions you want in the other room, but I think so we can see the work and spend time together. 2 questions. So if anybody has a burning question, let's start with you.
Anyway, there's a lot of pressure on that question.
If anybody has even one question.
What's in store for both of you in the coming future with your creations, if you have any ideas?
Well, for me, there's like no going back. I feel like getting art back into my life has been one of the best things that I could hope for. So I'm older, so I just relish it, I think.
That's a good question. I think that I think there's more thread work for me. I want to explore some new areas with fiber and textile arts. So yeah, and just get in the studio, right?
I'm going to make my comment in the form of a question, like Jeopardy. Were those the two best art talks you've heard in a long, long time?
Thank you. As Thanks, Mike. He was a plant, by the way. Okay.
You mentioned studio work. You both have made so much art in these past few years leading up to these exhibits. Has conquering the idea of perfectionism been a challenge in your work, and how has the studio and consistent art making played a role in that?
I'll start with
Yeah.
that. I read something that I loved, and it was, don't look for perfection, just look for excellence. And that was really powerful because, you know, once you put that perfection above you, it can keep you from doing anything. And then you start overthinking. So, yeah, I just go in there. And we didn't show you the bad art.
I did, remember?
No. I mean, there's some stuff that, when I said painting poorly, there was some poorly painting going on.
It's kind of funny for me. I had a little bit of the opposite feeling. Like, I actually kind of dove into the feeling that it's okay to be sort of a tight painter who paints precisely. And, you know, when I went to college, all my professors were abstract expressionists. So it was really wonderful sort of to just give myself, like I said, I didn't have to worry about how I wanted to paint. I just painted the way I wanted to paint, which is tight. You know, I'm a pretty tight painter. I'm not super loose. And I kind of dove into it. I don't think it's called perfectionism, but it's, you know, it's giving myself license to do what I want to do if it's tight or not, you know.
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. Julie's picture's going to be.